Yeah, okay, so before I sort of go into like the main thing, I want to just introduce myself and my work and sort of like the context of what and why I guess I'm researching with this. So my name is Kamila and I work under the name Pigeon. I'm an illustrator and comics maker from Poland, but I've been living in Wales for just over 9 years now. Yeah, so this is just sort of the overview and me in my sort of natural habitat, just usually seen first. And as you can see, my work is a combination of different things. I really enjoy like putting my illustrations on merchandise. I would love to do more clothes as well. I usually work with ink and brush drawings and then taking it into Photoshop, doing some digital coloring. And I also do comics, and I started with self-published books, and the book that I'm holding in the photo on the right is my Slavic mythology art book, which kind of like is a project that like kickstarted me going into like the rabbit hole of research of like folky and Eastern European things. Yeah, so I would like to tell you about some like upcoming projects that I'm quite excited about, and hopefully that will give you an idea of my work. In October, I'm going to have a short comic in an anthology, Let Her Be Evil. It's a comics anthology sort of embracing evil women and femmes just in general, and what I'm creating for it is a sort of my version of Marie Antoinette's story, because this is like one of my historical obsessions, and I just feel like she's a bit of a misunderstood historical figure. So that should be quite fun. It's very colorful and queer and also quite bloody, so if that's your kind of thing, we're kickstarting the anthology in October. In November, I will have a short editorial in Beneficial Shock magazine, which is a really good film magazine, and I've illustrated some mythical creatures for their like history section. So they go through different like cult things from different decades and sort of analyze the like monstrous mythical beings in these films and what is their cultural significance and why do they seem so powerful. I didn't write the text, I just did the illustrations, but like, it's really interesting stuff, so look out for that issue as well. This is my main project that I've been working on throughout this whole year, and I've only finished like 2 weeks ago, and this sort of brings me to, I guess, my main topic of interest, which is the folklore and the mythical, and specifically Slavic folklore. So I've been working on the graphic novel, Rusałka, Whispers of the Forest, and it's a story of a Slavic water demon and sort of her journey of self-discovery. And the idea for this was to not just sort of take the source material and illustrate it, but do some folklore research and then present my own interpretation and add my own sort of spin to it. So what I'm doing here is I'm sort of telling this story from the point of view of this mythical creature that is usually, like she usually has like a sort of side role in the myths when you hear, since she's like a Slavic siren who lives by the water and sort of lures in men to drown them. But she also has a very tragic backstory, which I'm trying to explore in this graphic novel. And it has started when I was doing my master's degree in lockdown, which is a very interesting experience. And this is also when I started, like a lot of my work became very influenced by all the things that I've been reading and sort of looking into the place that I come from, which is very strange because, as I said, like I've been living away from Poland for over 9 years, and I think I needed sort of like quite a few years of this immigration experience to have like take a fresh look at the place I came from. I'd like to, talk a little bit about this and sort of talk about the context of why researching Slavic identity and Slavic folklore might be a bit of a tricky issue. So I sort of call this the uncanny Slavicness, which comes from this Polish writer and academic Maria Janon. She is exploring Slavic identity through post-colonial lens and exploring how Polish history and the antagonism between the Polish Catholic Church and their history of pre-Christian Slavic traditions. And when I read this book, I started looking deeper into this because I've been raised Catholic. I'm not anymore, but it's something that is a very, very strong influence if you grow up Polish. I feel like Polish people have a very difficult relationship with their heritage, and this is due to our history being quite filled with different historical traumas, you can say, through difficult relationship with West, which is very aspirational, but then also difficult relationship with East, especially with imperialist Russia and things like that. So for a long time, when we're talking about our Polish traditions or folklore, they weren't really viewed in a very positive light because of the history. But then on the other side, our sort of narration of what it means to be Polish and what it means to belong to Polish society is mainly formed by the current Catholic and far-right government, which is presenting a very, I'd say, narrow definition of Polish history, Polish tradition. So these are these influences, that I've had growing up in my childhood, but I've always been drawn to this other side of the stories that are still present, because a lot of traditions and stories are actually appropriated by the church from older Slavic people. And among all of this, there's actually a new trend emerging. I mean, right now it's actually developed quite a lot, which is basically Slavic folklore appearing in Polish pop culture. And I'd say this started around 2015, and since then it's become a huge thing in fantasy novels, and obviously we had things like the Witcher franchise, which definitely popularized it a little bit. And I was just wondering, why is this happening right now, and how is this relationship to heritage shifting? Yeah, so something that I have noticed, and this is one of the sort of, well, you can call it a trend, but it's something that I really enjoy, is seeing different illustrators showing their own versions of traditional Polish dress and folklore clothing and local clothing. And it began happening more and more often that you have different illustrators and comics makers who are portraying characters, expressing their queerness, and at the same time wearing clothing that's associated with something very traditional and often quite archaic. And through this, I feel like they started sort of shifting the associations with the national dress. And a lot of these images, some of them are obviously just like a joyful self-expression, but some of them, I think, are also a form of social commentary. For example, the illustration I have on the right here, that's an activist poster, and the text says, "Just dance and fight for human rights," and that was created specifically as a response to the government's actions. And this is the depiction that's fairly new and it's not very common. And I think it's really interesting how just through these kind of visuals we can expand the definition of who can belong, because unfortunately the way that this sort of myth of nationality is formed by the church and by the government is very exclusive and very much harmful to LGBTQ+ communities. So I guess the question is, how can we reclaim this in a more inclusive way? When I was sort of thinking about it and researching this, which was from the time that I did my master's, these were the main questions that I've been asking. And I wanted to narrow this down to illustration and comics, because obviously that's also the field that I work in. And I just wanted to see how folklore themes work in this area. So the questions were, how are the Polish artists incorporating folklore themes into their work? And also through this, are there maybe possible new cultural meanings in that, let's call it Slavic folklore revival? And also I'm interested in what is the relationship between the audience of comics and visual media and the Slavic heritage, and how can it be changed through it. I was trying to do some academic research into it, and this is not really a field that's explored a lot in the Polish context. So I've been looking at theories about folklore storytelling and theories about comics, but I really would like to see this research going further, and so I just wrote this little sort of wish list of the outcomes of this kind of conversation. So I think it would be great to see expanding and diversifying definitions of Polish or Slavic cultural identity through artwork. I would love to see this kind of stories becoming more inclusive through the use of folklore. And obviously all of this is also sharing the folklore with other people and preserving it. But it would be great to do this while also considering this kind of difficult socio-political context and not touching it. Okay, this is a very text-heavy one. I promise that it's not going to be too much of it. But just to sort of explain what was I doing to explore these questions and to find the answers. While I was studying, my studies were combining anthropology and art analysis, but I really wanted to actually include voices and insights of real people and real creators. And I didn't want this to be just biased through my own work. So in 2021, I did a short interview study, and that was done in collaboration with Cardiff Metropolitan University. That's where I did my master's degree. So I reached out to some of the Polish comics creators who are very prominently using Slavic folklore or the mythical themes in their work. And I met up with them online and just wanted to ask them some questions to see what are their attitudes towards their own heritage and how do they see the effects of what they do with the artwork. And we talked a bit about the topics of representation through illustration and comics, and the clash between old and the new, and also the way that we use folklore themes as a visual metaphor. And through this, really what I wanted to see is examine the process of creating new meanings through visual storytelling. And I was reading this book, Contemporary Comic Storytelling by Karin Kukkonen. And if anyone is sort of very nerdy about comics, I really recommend it because that mini-making process of comics is exactly what she was describing. She was analyzing more American titles. I just wanted to see it in the Slavic context as well. To explore this topic, I looked at few theories and concepts that were sort of constantly popping up, and they were repeatedly showing when I was analyzing artwork and when I was talking to the artists. So I just wanted to sort of give you some examples. So firstly, it was looking at the, let's call it traditional folklore, sort of stories collected from the past as we know them, and how in these stories we see the so-called mythical thinking and magical thinking. So this is how we perceive these stories and what kind of function do they actually have in our society. And these might be quite obvious, but I think it's just useful to state it. So obviously the stories were created to explain the complexities of our universe and explain forces of nature or difficult emotions. And they were also used as cautionary tales, like the examples I have here, that would be forest demons or Baba Yaga, which I think everyone is fairly familiar with. And because the stories are passed from generation to generation, they create this continuity. But if we take the example of Baba Yaga, she's a very interesting figure because the way that we understand her as a sort of mythical witch has changed a lot over the years. Is everyone familiar with Baba Yaga? Just to like double check. Okay, so obviously she's like this old crone reclusive witch living in the forest, in the house like with the chicken foods, and she was always just sort of portrayed as evil, kidnapping children to eat them, like this kind of thing. But I think as we saw in the feminist movement, like more embracing of witchcraft and nonconformist women, Baba Yaga also became like she just gained a completely new meaning as a independent woman, nonconformist woman, often also like the passer of knowledge. So so I just find it really interesting how these associations can shift purely through just representing and reimagining this character in media. Yeah, so for that, like I just started really enjoying all the like folklore and fairy tale retellings and the way that we can reimagine these stories in a new way. And as an example here, I want to give one of my favorite ones, which is Little Red Riding Hood, which is a fairy tale that like historically stems from an old folk tale. And I don't know if you are familiar with sort of the history behind it, but there are a lot of analysis like by psychologists and sociologists that sort of see a lot of symbolism in this tale, the symbolism of girlhood and coming of age, sort of discovering like nonconformism and dangers, and a lot of theories also connect the sort of the everlasting like red with like menstrual blood. So the writer Angela Carter is anyone familiar with Angela Carter and like the Bloody Chamber? Yes, so she reimagines Little Red Riding Hood like in quite a few stories, but she also works with other tales like Beauty and the Beast, for example. And I feel like her short story collection, The Bloody Chamber, is like a great example of how you can take these stories and you can just show them from a completely different lens. And the way that she does it is sort of following this, pattern of the retellings. So she will be using the familiar genre traits, so like the trait of a fairy tale or the sort of like a horror genre. So connecting the viewers with something familiar, like the collective cultural memory, but at the same time, she will highlight a completely new aspect. Like for example, the female characters in her stories will be highlighting like their wild and feral and dangerous side, which is something that obviously we don't really see in the traditional fairy tales. And you know, her stories were and still are incredibly influential for a lot of artists. So I think this is like a really good example of how this pattern can work to create completely new meanings and associations. And lastly as well, because I was focusing directly on comics and like visual storytelling, I was wondering if we take these two mediums, so comic storytelling and folk storytelling, what kind of similarities can we find between one and the other? And I know that maybe it sounds a little bit random because they are like very different from each other. But as I was looking further, it started sort of making sense that folklore appears in comics as well, because both of these mediums are very like creatively forgiving. Like the creative boundaries are very, very loose. You can sort of have so many different interpretations, and both of them have a very heavy use of metaphor, because in comics we're using visual metaphor to convey like time and sound and all the things that normally, I don't know, it's like very, very specific to this medium. And the same with folk tales through symbolism and metaphor, and using like anthropomorphic characters. We are like communicating like difficult concepts. And both of these fields and mediums are also very accessible through the fact that they can be very visual and metaphorical. So these are the sort of main aspects of these retellings that I was looking at. And I have a little summary here. So they map new tropes for interpretation, create that folkloric memory, so connect the audience with what they already know. But at the same time, because it's showing it through a different lens, it allows to understand any kind of otherness and any kind of different point of view. So my summary was that the sequential art becomes like a bridge between two dimensions, what's old and the new, and creates a new continuity. So now I just want to give a few examples of the actual work of the artist I was talking to when I did my interview study. So as I said, there were 4 Polish artists, and they are all very much recognized on the Polish comic scene. First of them was Adam Święcki. I was looking at his series of dark folklore stories. They are like a series of short comics. The one that I have here as an example translates to Forest Licho, and to be honest, it was a very strong inspiration for me when I started working on my graphic novel as well, because what he does in this comic is he takes this character of Licho, and Licho is understood in sort of Polish legends as this really gremlin-like, disgusting little thing that crawls into caves and just causes mayhem basically. But in his comic, Licho is this female demon that tries to sort of save the forest from destructive forces of humans who are trying to build a church on a sacred hill. So, but because she is Licho and she's sort of at the bottom of that forest hierarchy, she's not really listened to. Maybe because I'm so fond of Angela Carter's work, I really like the way that Święcki is working with the sort of monstrous feminine, and so it's the monster woman is the hero, and she's the one that we whose perspective we're understanding, and through this I guess he just creates a lot of empathy for this creature, and humanizing her, which I think is very interesting. I was also talking to another illustrator and comic maker. Her name is Katarzyna Wittersheim. Her work is also available in English, so if you're interested in what I'm talking about, you can find her work on Tapas and Twitter. She is one of the first illustrators that started illustrating queer characters wearing Polish traditional clothing. She sort of started this trend. And by this point, she has a long series of very interesting illustrations, but the one on the left is very, very prominent because it's showing clothing from the region of Silesia, which is the artist's home region. That's sort of southern Poland, and it has, the region has its own very prominent history, its own language, and she is very much connected to it, so she represents it all in her work. So on this illustration, the Silesian clothing obviously has the colors of the lesbian and trans flags, and after creating this, she was also working with a LGBTQ+ charity, and the prints became this activist media, which I think is very cool. And on the right is her non-binary character Sambor, and they are a sort of witchy herbalist character, and the artist said that because as well this was one of the really first depictions like this in popular comics, she was getting responses, for example, from teachers who were using the example of Sambor's story as teaching materials. So it's really interesting to see how this kind of work can have quite a strong impact on the community. And I was talking to her a bit more as well about that Silesian identity, so her connections to the region that she's from. Her main comic series is called Helena Victoria. Also, you can read it in English, so if you want some more context, it's there. And the story is It's a very beautifully drawn, like romance drama, historical romance, but it is all set in Silesia, so the sort of the local culture and local language is very much reflected, and it's done in a very sort of refreshing and creative way. Yeah, and also obviously the series incorporates very diverse characters, and yeah, it's very like it's basically one of a kind. I was interested because she dedicates so much of her work to Silesia. What is her approach to the label of patriotism? Because it's a very inflammatory term, obviously because of all the political context, and understandably so. And for her, very much like she wanted to reclaim this term and sort of feel that she can have that connection with her heritage without any negative associations. And so there's a quote as well that she said when we were talking. So patriotism shouldn't be a cultivation of empty slogans, but embracing the people, because there is no nation without the people we created. So obviously this can be like a whole another discussion, but yeah, I just found it very interesting because pretty much all of the other artists that I was talking to were very strongly distancing themselves from like patriotism and sort of national pride and anything like that. Adam Święcki was one of the artists that didn't really want their work to be associated with like patriotism or like glorifying any national values, which is understandable. And he told me that patriotism seems like an alien concept to him, but he was very interested in the ideas of community and sort of like preservation of this old storytelling that's independent from the borders of the country. And he said that this is what he's trying to do through his comics. It's quite interesting as well because I think his work has quite a lot of social commentary to it. The example, which is unfortunately in Polish, is on the left, and that's from the Forest Licho comic, and it's a confrontation between the Catholic priest who's trying to like destroy the forest and build a church, and the sort of neutral party character, and she's this old wise woman called like the Whispering Witch. And it's very interesting that in these stories we have these two camps of the mythical creature and the humans, but it's the Whispering Witch who is sort of a bridge between the two, and she can exist and communicate with both the mythical and the human, and seems to be able, like, she seems to be the only one that has like the real knowledge about the situation. And the characters of the Whispering Witch and sort of the old wise woman appears in few of his comics. So sort of that's, I guess, like aligned with the what we talked about like understanding Baba Yaga and like elevating witchcraft. So lastly, there was an artist duo that I was talking to as well, Agata Hop and Patrycja Pustelnik, and they are a little bit newer on the Polish scene, but they've been creating this folk horror series, Wianek or Flower Wreath, which has already been like he's gotten like the best debut indie comics award last year, and I think he's nominated something else this year. So obviously it's having like quite a big impact. So I was talking to them as well, and they were more interested into researching like almost like a pan-Slavic relationship between all of the Slavic countries. So they are very interested in the folklore of Belarus, and the comic is set on the Polish like eastern border, which is also the area that has been very patronized like over the history, and it has like a lot of its own local folklore, which is very mystical, and this is also where the Whispering Witches come from. So I think it's quite important to sort of elevate that region. And they use a lot of, like this sort of visual metaphor to convey horror in the comic, and it's all using the customs from that region. So they're using that sort of a fabric doll called mutanka, which is a doll that's being made in like a lot of Slavic countries. And sort of you make it with an intention, and in the comic, it's an intention of protection. And they're telling a story of a girl from an abusive family, so sort of like a character that otherwise would go unheard, but she's the protagonist of the series. And I don't really, because it's an ongoing series, I don't really want to spoil too much. Again, you can read it in English on Webtoon if you are interested, but I definitely recommend it to see, because it's very much like just immersed in that Eastern Polish folklore. I guess as a sort of summary of everything, I know this was very like information heavy. I think that in the work of these artists, like I could see that mechanism of folklore retellings that I mentioned in the beginning, through using the genre that we understand, like romance, historical drama. They can depict their folklore elements in a completely new light, and and you can see it's relevant to the audience, and you can see it's really like gaining very strong response from the Polish audience. So I would like to see this sort of developing further, and I think that I'll be exploring it further to see what kind of metaphorical aspects and like potential for creating new associations we have through working with folklore. Okay, so this is just for any nerds here who would like to see some reading, and I think only 2 of them are in Polish. The rest is in English, I promise. But I especially recommend the Karin Kukonen's writing because it's like fairly recent, and if you're interested into like understanding the mechanisms like comic storytelling, she's very, very good. So I don't know, I hope this was interesting, and if there are any questions or if there's anything that wasn't clear, like I'd love to chat for a little bit. I don't know if like all of you are sort of into folklore and like familiar with Slavic folklore at all. But I'd love to hear some thoughts, if there are any thoughts.